Hi everyone, welcome back to What is This Weapon? I'm Jonathan, as I hope you know by now, but I am joined by a special guest. This is Ian of Cold War Conversations, which is a podcast that you should definitely check out. How long have you been doing that for, Ian? And where can people find it, more importantly?
I've been doing it about 7 years now. Cold War Conversations is essentially an oral history podcast. So it's first-hand accounts of people's experiences of the Cold War. So it's not just military, it's civilian. We've got some great spy stories. So if you ever wanted to know what it was like to escape across the Berlin Wall or be a border guard on the Iron Curtain, or even a KGB spy deep undercover, then Cold War Conversations is definitely for you. It's available on all the major podcast platforms, and it's also on YouTube.
Excellent. Well, those of you who watch this series know a bit about guns. We've been talking about the Cold War just now. So why on earth do we have a World War II German rifle on the table? Well, it's a jumping off point for the star of this episode, which is going to be the German G3 rifle. But before we get there, we have to set the scene. The reason this is here is that it's what both halves of Germany end up stuck with in 1945. Simple question, is 1945 the beginning of the Cold War?
In my view, it is, but a lot of people disagree on when the Cold War
Of course
starts.
They do.
So we don't want to spend hours working through that. So describing the Cold War is a challenge, but I'm going to have a go at it. So at the end of World War II, essentially the world was split into two main power blocks, those that were allied to the Soviet Union and those that were allied to the US. Soviet Union allies were primarily socialist in the nature of their governments. The ones allied to the US were primarily democratic and capitalist in their format. The victorious allies split Germany into occupation sectors. The British, the French and the American had the western part of Germany, and the Soviet Union had the eastern part of Germany. This was complicated further by the situation of Berlin, where Berlin was also split into occupation sectors, despite it being 100 miles in the Soviet sector. Berlin was a real flashpoint during the Cold War. It really was where those tectonic plates rubbed together. And although the Cold War is described as a Cold War, i.e. a war without fighting, there was a lot of fighting in the Cold War. And the weapons that we're going to be talking about today were very closely involved in those. So, Jonathan, what have we got here?
Well, it's not a G3. We've got a couple of steps.
Even I can tell that.
We've got a couple of steps before we can get to the main event on the weapons side of things. But I thought it was important to start off with this thing, because, I mean, it's logical enough, isn't it? The war has ended. You're not going to suddenly switch to some new weapon. Yeah. And they didn't. So both the East and the West halves of Germany are by default equipped with the wartime Kar-98K. It's very well known. Simple bolt-action rifle, 5-round magazine, manually operated, of course. You could almost have picked any for this, but we happen to have one that was made post-war, pretty immediately post-war. And you can kind of see that in the workmanship. It's not the truly awful last-ditch stuff of the end of 1945, but it ain't great. I mean, have a look at that stock.
It's certainly roughly hewn, this stock here, but
that's the job.
Better quality than the Volkssturm might have got.
Exactly, yeah, way better. So we've gone back up to that level. You can see that there are cast grind marks, file marks on there, but it's got a decent finish. This is good enough. But is it really good enough? It's not a self-loading rifle. It's not the new assault rifle that Germany had invented by the end of the war. So the two halves of Germany are going to go literally back to the drawing board and look at where they can get either a self-loading rifle or an assault rifle. Two schools of thought there. Let's see where it goes from here.
Can't wait to dive in.
So before we get into the main event, and I'll stop teasing here, we're going to be looking at the G3, the West German G3 rifle. However, that's not the first self-loading rifle adopted by the new Bundeswehr. This is as I'm sure some of you knew, this is generically, the Belgian FN Herstal FAL, light automatic rifle in French. And this becomes a very significant weapon in its own right. NATO, another spoiler here, but NATO never ends up adopting a standard service rifle. But this is one of the candidates for it, and the other is the G3. And Germany, despite being quite famous for having the Heckler & Koch G3, actually procures 100,000 of these. Now, there's some interesting rumour and speculation around this. Being a Belgian company, so that the extreme version of this, which I can't vouch for, is that FN only wanted to sell the new West German Republic rifles. It did not want to license them. There are different ways that a nation can equip itself with service rifles or any weapon or piece of equipment. And the two main ones are just buying them, and you maybe get your national crest on there. Mm-hmm. And the other is we will pay to have, maybe even the guys come, and your engineers come and set up a factory for us, and then we crank them out, which ends up being cheaper in the long run. You've got control of your own destiny, as it were. You're not beholden to that nation if you then maybe fall out with them in some way. And the rumour around this is that the Belgian FN company just didn't like the idea of their recent enemy producing their rifle. I cannot vouch for that at all. I suspect that's a bit of myth. The truth, though, is that the new West Germany did want its own homegrown, not just manufacture, but its own. They might have settled for that, I suppose, but they wanted their own homegrown German design. They weren't unique in that. Britain wanted the same. America famously really wanted that, and that's why the British EM2 was binned. And there's a book about that, I think, or partly about that. So there are actually two standard service rifles going into the end of the 1950s. These are manufactured, I think it's 1957, 58, at FN Herstal in Liège, and shipped to the Germans. There's an initial order for the border guard. So if we think of where we're going with all of this, we end up with a G3 on one side of the German border and the Kalashnikov on the other side. Well, that's kind of where this is coming from. Very, very similar in effect, similar barrel length, same cartridge, which is the 7.62 by 51 standardized NATO round. Still quite a big old pokey cartridge, still in service today, of course, around NATO and around the world. Without getting into the weeds too much on the ammo, this is essentially America's choice for the future NATO standard round. They had their existing long, powerful bolt action and then self-loading rifle cartridge in the 30-06 in the Garand rifle, the famous, excellent Garand rifle. And they were trying to keep as close to that template as possible for their new self-loading or maybe automatic rifle that would load itself with every pull of the trigger. Well, Garand already did that, but they were hoping now that it would be automatic as well. The problem there is that this is just too powerful. They've shortened the case, making the round a bit lighter for logistical purposes, but the actual soldierly experience of firing it isn't really much softer at all. Who cares? Beef up your shoulders is the answer to some extent, but that means your follow-up shots, if you're trying to hit that guy over there, your first shot is not on, and your muzzle might be up here. So even in semi-automatic, this can be argued as being a bit too much. Depends on the sort of terrain you want to fight on, though. Some nations to this very day, Turkey, for example, Greece, they've still got G3 rifles, which is where we're eventually going with this. So that's the round. This is the rifle. It is clear if you'd like to have a look. So there would have been an overlap here. The border guard probably kept them for a lot longer, actually, into the early 60s, mid-60s, and the Bundeswehr, at least the mid-60s, still had the G1 rifle. This is basically why the G3 is the G3 and not the G1, because we already have the FAL.
Now, back in the 60s and 70s, when I was a kid, Airfix did a plastic version of these, just like this. And obviously, this is significantly heavier than the one that I had as a kid. And one of the big challenges was that always used to snap off. So you'd end up having them looking like a short Lee Enfield barrel on
Oh, okay.
on there. But
I was never lucky enough to have one of those. I think.
oh, they were quite sought after, actually.
Now that was, I believe, a really detailed model of the L1A1 British version of the FAL. So you've got in your hands the alternate reality standard West German
Right.
rifle. So we could have had a NATO that really did have all the same rifle and all the same rifle and machine gun round. But it didn't go that way, as we're about to see.
So as far as firing one of the, because I'm not that familiar with, well, I'm familiar with the names of them and what they look like, but the actual mechanisms of them I'm not familiar with. So is this just pull the trigger and it'll fire and then reload the chamber, or?
Yeah, so from the, in its most basic sense, this isn't much different than the M1 Garand from 1936 that the Americans had, that very, in greater numbers than any other major armed force, and they're able to fire up to 8 shots before it's empty as rapidly as they can pull the trigger. And you get that rapid follow-up shot thing, and then if you're going into a trench or through a doorway or something, you can really sort of spam the trigger, and it's not as good as a submachine gun, but it's better than a bolt action for sure. You know, you've got Brits having to fire from the hip middle finger with their bolt actions and relying on the bayonet because they don't have the ability to just keep pulling the trigger. The self-loading rifle becomes therefore one of the standards of the Cold War period, because you want every soldier to have the ability to keep pulling the trigger, keep shooting bullets, or to have an automatic weapon, a light machine gun, a submachine gun. And this is where we get into our two schools of thought that diverge so much between West and East Germany. The West Germans, with this and the G3, are sticking to this model of a full power rifle cartridge. You can see it from the depth of the magazine here. You know, and of course you're carrying a ton of these, hundreds of rounds, 200 rounds at least, depending on the armed force in question. That just rocks in there. You just pull back and release the cocking handle, and then you have your safe position, semi-automatic position, and then on not all of the FALs, but most of them, this would then rotate round to automatic. This one is actually stopped at semi, and the British FAL was permanently semi-automatic only.
Right.
And long story short, that's really the most important thing: the ability to fire rapid, aimed shots, not Rambo style automatic fire. That's still somewhat useful for close quarter battle. Still exists on rifles today, but that ability to just get a new round into the chamber from the magazine is the key thing, and has existed since the late 19th century. There are self-loading rifles, but they're not there yet. This is a very mature design, a very good design, and for other nations becomes their standard service rifle, as we've said. Germany, for either reasons of national pride and logistical ease and being self-sustaining, maybe a bit of resentment on the Belgian side, we're not sure, bins this off. So by the end of the 1960s, I don't think certainly no frontline troops are going to have this. So let's get rid. So, bit of a red herring there with the G1. We then go to the iconic Heckler & Koch H&K G3. So this, we don't have a super early version, but this one is 1960s. Just check. 1964. This one. We have early weapons of this type, but we don't have an early issue one. And there are really early weapons of this type. So this has a lineage that we can trace back to the end of the Second World War with Nazi Germany, and it's to do with that piston system. They just get rid of it. They use instead something called delayed blowback. So almost a bit more like a submachine gun, like the Sten or the Sterling. The bolt is moving without requiring gas pressure from a tube or a pipe, and there's no rod smacking it. And
does that make it less likely to jam, or is there a technical reason as to why you would do that?
Simplicity and cost are the drivers. It's more of a manufacturing thing than it is a user thing. Any saving in weight is really more of a balance thing because you still need some chunky bits of metal. But under here is just this is just a cocking tube. The cocking handle's up here now, so instead of pulling it from back here, you're pulling it from up here. The drills are different as a result of that. There's the famous HK slap where you lock it into the. Didn't do it with the FAL, but. So there's a lot of leverage required here because the means of delay are a pair of rollers. So it requires some really precise, clever engineering to make this work because you have to keep this shut for as long as, well, not for as long as possible, but until pressure has dropped to a safe level, so it's not going to blow up the gun, and so that you're not wasting the gas pressure behind the bullet and losing velocity. So that has to stay shut until it is time to open it. And the way that's very precisely determined is by the angle of a wedge and and two rollers that act upon it. So it's all done back here. The magic all happens back here. Nothing's happening up here. All this is a way to cock it, which means there's quite a lot of inertia here as you're forcing the bolt carrier backwards, and then it frees up, and you can pull that back and lock it open, and then the famous slap to close it.
Yeah.
Now, relevant to our discussion here, apparently in the Bundeswehr, that is a no-no. That's abusing the weapon. You're not supposed to do that. We get this in comments. But in the H&K manual, that's how you close the bolt. So, you can get into the weeds of drills and things, but functionally it's much the same.
And you mentioned the precision of the mechanism there. I mean, if you got dirt or something in there, would that crucial piece of precisionness is the wrong word, but you know what I'm saying there.
Yeah.
Does that make it a problem in the field?
It can be. I mean, I would say that the G3 is probably more robust and reliable than the FAL. I'll probably get some comments for saying that. But if you get dirt, sand, and crud into an action of any firearm, you've got a problem.
Yeah.
The bolt is probably not going to lock in properly, and you can bang on it and it might go in, or it might not, or you can follow your drill and cycle out the dirty round, hastily clean it and reload it. So it's a problem for any firearm. In this case, yeah, you might get dirt in the recess, the locking, or it's not technically locked shut. It's that delayed blowback system, but you can still foul it up if you don't look after it properly. It doesn't have a dust cover over the ejection opening. Neither did the FAL. The AK does if the lever is closed. So that's the most critical thing for that kind of trench situation of getting crud in your weapon, is if the thing is sealed before you fire it. Once you fire it, dust covers are opened and things can get in. But so that's a weak point, but it's a weak point on rival designs. Famously, the AK kind of runs on full power all the time with a great big gas piston, a lot of mechanical advantage, a great big massive bolt carrier with that piston attached. So it kind of powers through, all things being equal, more readily. And maybe doesn't need as much babying and twice daily cleaning and that kind of thing. This really does come from the mindset of precision engineering, expensive stuff. I mean, they're saving money by making fewer parts, but in the scheme of things, it still costs more than an AK to well, I say that. Scale of production matters more than anything else, AKs aren't cheap unless you have a huge factory.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I've got a theory on the Heckler & Koch manual, is that they recommended the slap back because they knew it would wear out quicker, and so they'd get more replacements required.
Oh, conspiracy theory.
Who doesn't love a conspiracy theory on YouTube? Come on.
Interesting. I would maybe counter that by a more modern HK product, the HK 416, they have actually worked quite hard to make that less of a thing. That kind of built-in parts breakage, parts wear thing that we might cynically complain about with our cars and things. I'm not saying that's not true, but I think you have to think about reputation. And is an armed force going to come back and buy the next generation? After this comes the G36. After that comes the HK 416. Are they going to keep coming back to the well? if they know that you, well, especially if they know you do it deliberately, but even if your guns just aren't that robust in the long run. So this from 1958 onwards, it takes a while to make enough to equip everyone, of course, and you've always got tiers of units that have the last thing or something else. This is one of the iconic Western NATO arms of all time, I would say, and it's persisted through to this day. But at its jumping off point here in the Cold War, we are looking at essentially the two sides of the Berlin Wall. And you've got guards, you've got regular army, you've got police units as well. Are they all getting these things?
Well, certainly the West Berlin police force were issued with these, which was a paramilitary organisation because West Germany could not station any military, any troops in West Berlin. Indeed, West Berlin was a sanctuary for many students because you couldn't be conscripted into the Bundeswehr, the West German army, if you lived in West Berlin. So certainly the West Berlin police force would have been equipped with these, and they did have a particular role to play if the Soviets or the East Germans invaded East Berlin. They would have worked with the Allied occupation forces to assist in the defence of Berlin.
So I tend to come at this from I think in terms of design philosophies, and you have this quite sleek, I mean, maybe the M16 even more so, but you have this sleek, semi-plastic, advanced technology, precision engineering, some really quite cleverly designed sights, and I think maybe in simplistic terms, West versus East, you know, the AK is, and it's often said by others, the AK is simple and cheap and anyone can use it, and things like the G3, the FAL, the M16, those are more complicated, and it's this West-East dichotomy of technology, approaches to technology, agricultural versus space age almost at its most simplistic. Is that kind of reflected in any way in the history? Or is it really just they happen to have these guns, those guys happen to have those?
Well, I think
Does it really
certainly
matter?
if you look, I mean, if you're looking at the AK, they did manage to get standardization across the Soviet Union and the entire Warsaw Pact and a lot of other nations as well in a much more successful way than they did in the West. And that's probably more around how the commercial operations worked in the West because, you know, the US want to build their own. Mm-hmm. The Germans want to build their own. They want to support their manufacturing industry. Whereas in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, it's a whole different way of organising the economy there with far less commercial pressures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably the nub of that one. There are egos involved as well. Mm-hmm. You know, the famous Colonel Studler in the US trying to like skew or steer the Leviathan of military procurement toward a homegrown rifle or homegrown round, and they succeed. They were looking at the FAL pretty hard. Arguably, that was the better choice than what they ended up with. But no, it's what's best for America and self-contained. Whereas, as you say, Warsaw Pact and beyond that sphere of influence, you end up with something that is, in theory, interchangeable, ammo and weapon across the whole swathe, which NATO just doesn't achieve. What they do achieve, of course, in the West and the East, they still have that sphere of influence in terms of technology, of military equipment. This thing, along with a suite of other designs, because as we say, they don't settle on one like the other side do. But this is successful. This is a commercially successful product. It shows up, licensed produced in other countries, other NATO countries, but beyond as well, and has its own afterlife, and is one of the most produced service rifles in history, albeit way down the running order from the AK. So where have you seen this pop up beyond that kind of East-West Berlin scenario?
Well, I've seen it in Portugal. The Portuguese army used it as their standard weapon, and they were involved in extensive colonial wars in Africa in the early part of the Cold War. And probably some of the most iconic photos of the Portuguese army with the G3 is during the Carnation Revolution, which was in the mid-1970s, where the army overthrew the authoritarian government that had been in place for about 48 years. And the civilian population supported the army in this coup, and they planted red carnations in the barrels of the guns of the soldiers as they were patrolling the cities and factories. And there's some incredible photos of of that. I've also seen them in Chile. So during the coup against the socialist president Salvador Allende, there's a number of photos of the G3 on the streets there. Interestingly, there are also some of the neutral countries as well. So Sweden were manufacturing the G3 under license, and Sweden is often semi-written out of the Cold War because they were neutral, but they had a very large conventional force aimed really as a deterrent because they didn't really have anything else to deter the Soviet Union with. And in conjunction with the military force, they also had set up for guerrilla forces as well. So their aim was to sort of delay or try and make an attack on Sweden as costly as possible for any attacker, i.e. the Soviet Union. But the G3 was certainly very popular in Sweden.
It really was. In fact, I think my impression of I've spent less time talking to Swedish veterans than British ones, but my impression is that they regarded this similarly to the SLR. Big, powerful, feels like it's having a real effect when you shoot it, and perhaps it even is having a really big effect when you shoot it. And so it's fondly remembered, and is still around in different ways. There's an aftermarket and a civilian interest. Surplus collectors, shooters. It's one of those iconic rifles in that respect. The AK-4 being the designation in Sweden. Ironically, Germany has a false start with an FN product and goes to the Heckler & Koch G3. Sweden sort of does it the other way around and replaces their G3 variant with an FN, a 5.56 FN rifle, which is a successor to the FAL.
And how do the veterans like that change? Do they always like their firstborn more than their...
It's I think this is a broad generalization, but regardless of Sweden, Britain, or anywhere else, it's generational to a large extent. If you grew up on the old rifle, you're going to think of it very fondly, and if the new one came in while you were still in, you're probably going to hate that. Whereas if all you've ever known is the AK-5, the FNC,
your first love.
Yeah, broadly speaking, I think others will have other views, and then certain service rifles are just kind of roundly despised anyway. Let's not go there. But the G3 is not one of them. It's it does pop up all over the place, as we've alluded to, and you rarely see a bad thing said about it. Even though that big old cartridge does make it quite a handful, and there are HK rifles in 5.56mm that might be a better option, but they're still out there. So I've been keen to not turn this into that kind of top trumps G3 versus AK per se, but there are inevitably, due to this West-East sphere of influence thing, a number of conflicts where you end up with G3s on one side and AKs on the other. And a biggie is Iran-Iraq, isn't it?
Yeah, and Iran-Iraq war is a fascinating war. It's one of those conflicts that happens during the Cold War, which a lot of people don't remember. It started in 1980 with Iraq invading Iran and was a huge conflict, continued for about 10 years, massive, almost World War I style battles of huge numbers of troops trying to storm fixed positions such as trenches. Immense casualties there. I think what's interesting about the Iran-Iraq war is there's a real blurring between East and West here, because both the Soviet Union and the West backed Iraq in that war. Yet Iran was using the G3, and obviously Iraq were taking advantage of their Soviet allies in using the AK.
Yeah, I mean the Heckler & Koch marketing machine was in full gear by that point, and legitimately, Iran gets a license to produce its own, and this is topical, of course. They're still being produced to this day.
Wow.
This is arguably, in a number of ways, old hat, but it's still being made. You can't say that for the FAL that we've alluded to. That's not in. There's no one making from scratch brand new FALs. That's fading away. This thing is not. It's still out there, and Iran is one of those major producers. They have the crest on their they're identifiable. They're not identifiable from the distance, but we get sent grainy photos from conflict zones, and you go, yeah, that's an Iranian G3. And Iran being Iran, modern day Iran certainly, those are proliferating around the place. So, and then we even see them getting converted, made shorter and more Gucci, and they show up in all sorts of different conflict zones. So that the conventional conflict of Iran-Iraq, I mean, I must admit, I didn't realize the level of carnage there. That's astonishing. But then the thing is still around, still proliferating, still causing havoc. Well, it's not, but the users of it are potentially causing havoc with this thing. Certainly from that Western perspective, and it's might be the more significant. It's clearly, I think, just on numbers, the most significant conflict where that Western design philosophy meets the AK Soviet design philosophy, and wouldn't some oral history from the Iran-Iraq War be interesting?
Absolutely.
So do we think it's fair to say that the G3, along with other systems, as we said, there isn't just the one, reflects the capitalist, the commercial way of designing, manufacturing and issuing weapons?
I think it does. I mean, in the conversation that we've had, it reflects the competition that there was between nations that were allied to each other in terms of weapon systems. Whereas you look at the Eastern Bloc or the socialist countries, there was much more a degree of standardization there. So there's commercial influences that are impacting the HK and other Western weapons.
So that the difference in the economies that's what gets in the way of this being the standard NATO rifle, in the same way that the AK becomes a standard Soviet bloc rifle. Is that?
Yeah,
fair?
Potentially. I mean, in the East, you've got the command economies, so they're being centrally controlled, whereas here you've got independent commercial organizations who are trying to make a profit, and also nations who want to be in possession of their own destiny as far as weapons manufacture is concerned.
Well, that leads us to the end of this episode, but it leads us nicely into the follow-up, where we're going to look at that sort of Eastern view of things, really the Kalashnikov rifle, as one of the rivals, or the main rival to this thing, if we're thinking in those simplistic terms. So we'll see you for that part 2 next time.
Absolutely. Can't wait.